Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy. I hope once again that you're all doing well, staying safe, and hopefully all your classes are going well. Um, yeah, I think midterms are starting to come up, so I hope that those all go well for all of you. Our paper kind of acts as our midterm, so no need to worry about studying for a test. But since we have it's about a week, yeah, a week till your paper's due, just be sure that you've started on it and you're working on it. And if you have any questions, just be sure to ask them ASAP, because it's kind of hard to answer questions once it's super close to the due date. So, yeah, hope everybody's getting started on that. And if you have any questions, let me know. If you want to run your thesis by me, or if you have something written up and you're just not sure, you can send it to me. But if you send me something like 2 days before, well, let's say 2 days before is like my it's like your last chance, kind of, just because from my experience, a lot of times people want to know like the day before, and then it's really overwhelming, and I don't have enough time to answer everybody. So, yeah. If you have something you want me to look over, then send it to me at least 2 days before the due date. And also, here's something else I was going to say. Maybe not. Maybe that was just it. Oh, and next Thursday we have our Zoom meeting. So be sure to keep up with any questions that you have throughout the class, because the purpose of the Zoom meetings is so that we can have some sort of conversation, dialogue. Because it's hard in these times, but that's why I built in those little Zoom meetings. So come ready next Thursday, and hopefully we will talk more than last time. Yeah, so today we're gonna dive into David Hume. Last time we focused on Descartes, and it's always good to read Descartes and Hume near each other, just because they're near each other in time, and Hume is kind of a response to Descartes' philosophy. So David Hume, also from the modern era. So he's 1711 to 1776. And he was Scottish philosopher. And he wrote a few different things. His most significant writings were the treatise on human nature, an inquiry concerning human understanding, and an inquiry concerning the principles of morals, and then also dialogues concerning natural religion. That is one of the most, that is a very significant one, because it's kind of what we talked about earlier in the class about the design argument for the existence of God. He combats that and disagrees with it. So he was one of the first modern philosophers to really go against the grain when it comes to religion and stuff like that. It is unclear if he was a Christian, but it's kind of, I don't know. It's kind of easy to assume that he probably wasn't, but he never outright said that because of the punishment that would come. So Descartes got in trouble for what he said, but he was still Catholic in most regards. Hume wasn't really. He wasn't very religious at all. So we'll kind of get into some of the distinctions between them. So after rereading this and just going through it, I realized that it's kind of sorry, I got distracted. That it's kind of hard to read, and it's possibly, I mean, maybe y'all are really awesome. You're still really awesome if you didn't understand, but maybe you're like way smarter than I was, and that it was super easy for you to understand, but it's kind of technical, and the writing isn't really how we talk, and he uses some technical terms that like coherence and constancy that might not make too much sense. So my goal is to give like an overall understanding of the piece, and then we can kind of dive into specifics, but I want you to understand what his point was, which I think is the most important thing in most philosophical writings. We can always get into the weeds, but if you start with an understanding of the basic things that a philosopher believes or is arguing for, then the details will make more sense. If you try to start from the details out, it's not going to make much sense, I don't think. So remember, this is modern philosophy. So in each philosophical era, there's typically like themes. So for modern philosophy, there were some very specific themes. One of the most important was the theme of substance. And I mean, we know what that word means just in everyday language, but substance for the modern era means something that exists independently. So Descartes wrote a lot about this, and we didn't touch on it too much, but we'll kind of get into it so you kind of see the differences between Descartes and Hume. Descartes' big thing was that there's three substances, but really there's one. Kind of. I'll explain what I mean. So Descartes argued that there were these three main substances: God, minds, and bodies. And in this period of philosophy, bodies doesn't only refer to like a human body or an animal body. It refers to like objects too. So it's kind of just like material things. So our body would count as that, but also like, you know, a piece of paper would count as a body. So don't let that confuse you too much. They're not always talking about human bodies. So Descartes argued for the existence of God, mind, and body. So his big thing was dualism, which kind of characterizes most rationalists of the time. A dualist believes that the mind and the body are separate entities, separate substances. And what I mean by what I said, that he believed in three substances, kind of, is that he kind of had a tricky little argument here, but God still has controls of some sort of mind and bodies. So it's kind of like God substance, mind, body, substance. So, and you may be thinking, well, if mind and body depend on God, then how could they be a substance in and of themselves? Well, that is an objection against Descartes. And he does have an answer to it, but it's kind of complicated, and we don't need to know it. You just need to know that Descartes, three substances: God, mind, bodies. And one of the reasons for separating mind and bodies was his faith, the faith of the time, Christianity. If you wanted to believe in an afterlife, which the Catholic or the Christian at the time would want to believe in an afterlife, then most people thought that you needed to account for the soul. So if your mind and body were the same thing, then when your body dies, your soul dies because they're the same substance. And that didn't jive with the theology of the time. You needed mind and body to be separate because, and I keep saying, I'm using mind and soul interchangeably because that's kind of how they use the term. Obviously, people wrote in different languages, and typically mind and soul were formulated under the term psyche, which accounted for both mind and soul. So don't let that mix you up either. Sorry. So what was I saying? Your soul needed to be independent of your body so that it could continue existing after your body. So that you could go to heaven or hell, and so when Hume comes on the scene and denies that the mind and body are distinct, that's kind of heresy for the time. He's not only making a philosophically significant statement, he's making a theologically significant statement. One that, of course, got him in trouble. But he was less concerned with that. So, you can we kind of see three different routes to go in the modern era. You could be like Descartes and say that mind and body are separate. You could be someone like Hume, and he doesn't say it in this passage, but he thought that they weren't separate, that there was only material objects, so your mind was just an extension of your body. Or you could go the Spinoza route, or we'll say Spinoza. So Spinoza believed in one single substance, kind of like Hume did, but instead of believing that that substance was material, Spinoza believed that the one substance was God. So everything that exists would be an extension of God. So you would be an extension of God. This marker would be an extension of God. Everything is a part of God, or is God. So that's kind of three different ways that substance was interpreted in the modern era. After John Locke, you kind of see a decline in the framework of substance, because it was kind of like he just felt like he didn't need it, and then people after him were kind of like, yeah, I guess we don't need the framework of substance. So whenever philosophers are operating under framework, just means if substance is the framework, then their philosophy is going to account for substance. And probably a lot of the minute details will have to do with substance. And I think we see that in Hume as well as Descartes for sure. So that's kind of just historical good stuff. Substance primarily was a Christian ideal at the time, because you wanted to say that the soul was a substance, and you wanted to say that God was a substance, that God was independent. Now, what's interesting is that Christians also believed that humans aren't fully independent of God, right? Because God does as he pleases and can control things, has sovereign power. So someone like Descartes kind of had to explain how that was the case. And you get into some really interesting variations from philosopher to philosopher. But so someone like Leibniz, he was also in the modern era of philosophy, he said that that there's one substance, God, but there are a few different monads. So a monad would be like a small independent substance. So it's not like the big substance, but it's it's almost like saying there's a dependent independent substance. He called it a dependent substance, which is kind of a contradiction, but he kind of tried to use that to get out of the hole that Spinoza put philosophers in at the time of making it to where God had to be the only substance, because he didn't want to be heretical and say that humans are God. So, anyways, the history of modern philosophy is really interesting with all the different things going on. So, but back to Hume. Hume, he was not a dualist. So he was not like Descartes. He didn't think that the mind and body were separate. And in this paper that you read, like I said, he doesn't come to that conclusion here. In this paper, he's just kind of coming to a skeptical conclusion of like all ideas don't seem right is kind of the conclusion. So let's just kind of go through that and we'll see what we come up with. So he asks a couple of questions. He asks, what causes induce us to believe in the existence of body? Once again, that's like material, not like human body. And then, is there body or not? And he doesn't really deal with the second question too much, because we assume that there is body just in asking that question. There's a presupposition there already. So his main question is, what are the causes that make us believe in the existence of body? And he, has a few different ideas, but one of the things that he points out is the continued existence of objects, even when they're not present to the senses. So I am looking at this marker right now. Oh gosh. And now I'm not looking at the marker. So does that marker have a continued existence when I'm not looking at it? Is it on the ground right now? I can't see it, so maybe not. Maybe. But, most of us would say, yeah, it's probably on the ground. And now I'm looking at it again, and either you could argue that it just appeared again, or you could say it has a continued existence outside of my perception. So, let's see. So he wants to figure out whether it's the senses, reason, or imagination that produces the opinion of there being a continued existence. So do my senses encourage me to believe that this marker exists when I'm not looking at it? Or does my reason cause me to think that this marker exists when I'm not looking at it? Or is it imagination? And imagination in Hume's language means more of like, the best way I can think to describe it is like taking an image in your mind. So it's not like imagination, like thinking up crazy things. It's just like taking an image of what you see, kind of. So it's kind of like perception. So Hume kind of just first denies that it's because of the senses. Because my senses, whenever I'm looking at this marker, I believe that I see it, but if I put it down and I'm not looking at it, my senses have nothing to do with my idea that it still exists. Because it's outside of my senses, I'm not sensing it anymore. So he's kind of quick to get rid of that idea. Something we can also touch on in modern philosophical history is the idea of identity. So a lot of this has to do with identity. Let's see, I'll read a quote here. Okay. 'Tis certain there is no question in philosophy more abstruse than that concerning identity and the nature of the uniting principle which constitutes a person. So identity was a problem in philosophy, and whenever there's a problem in philosophy, there's typically a lot of different answers to that problem. So John Locke was big on identity. He suggested this idea of, if you have, suppose there is an 80-year-old man, and whenever he was 16, he went off to war. He doesn't remember any of that anymore. And pretty much everything about him has changed. Like, the way he looks, he's gotten older. He just doesn't look the same as he did at 16. So what makes that man the same person? It may seem like an obvious question, but it's actually kind of difficult to answer. Because you can't really say, you can't say memory. So, the fact that I remember being a child doesn't mean that that child is the same as me. You can't base it based off memory, because there are people who have memories of that don't have memories of their past that actually happened. So what unites all of the experiences of a person into the person that they are? That's a problem in modern philosophy. And that's why Hume says that there is no question in philosophy more abstruse than that concerning identity. And he says it's absurd to imagine that the senses could ever distinguish identity. So, once again, he kind of moves on from that. So, then, let's see. I'm trying to make it simple, but also touch on the important things. Okay. So, after he does away with senses, he considers whether it's reason that makes us believe in the continued and distinct existence. Also, I explained what continued existence meant, but distinct existence is just that it's separate. So this marker is separate from this whiteboard, which is separate from this pen. So distinct just means separate existence. So, we may observe in this instance of sounds and colors that we can attribute a distinct continued existence to objects without ever consulting reason or weighing our opinions by any philosophical principles. And indeed, whatever convincing arguments philosophers may fancy they can produce to establish the belief of objects independent of the mind, 'tis obvious these arguments are known but to very few, and that 'tis not by them that children, peasants, and the greatest part of mankind are induced to attribute objects to some impressions and deny them to others. So, in short, what he means is that reason can't be the reason that you believe in continued existence, because a child, whenever they see you hold something shiny or something and you put it behind your back, they're not looking at it. They know that it's behind your back. I mean, maybe not infants, but 2-year-olds know. So, and they're not using reason in that case. They're not thinking it through I just saw something shiny and then that woman put it behind her back. So that means that the shiny object is still there. So that object has a continued existence. There's none of that thought process going on. It's just, they just have this idea, they have this concept, and they can't describe it to you. And if you tried to force them, they would have no idea what you're talking about. But they do have some understanding of continued existence. So it can't be it can't be senses that convince us, and it can't be reason. So the last thing we have is imagination. So he says, since all impressions are internal and perishing, sorry, I always get like the hiccups at the worst times. Since all impressions are internal and perishing existences and appear as such, the notion of their distinct and continued existence must arise from a concurrence of some of their qualities with the qualities of the imagination. And since this notion does not extend to all of them, it must arise from certain qualities peculiar to some impressions. 'Twill therefore be easy for us to discover these qualities by a comparison of the impressions to which we attribute a continued and distinct existence with those which we regard as internal and perishing. So he kind of distinguishes between internal and external impressions. So an internal, I guess he's just referring to internal perception here, which is what's happening in your mind. Your impression of something would be distinct from your imagination of something. So, I can have a sense impression. If I see something, I'm sensing it, and it's being impressed upon me. And then I'm also at the same time having an internal imagination of what I'm seeing. So he talks about this as like kind of a double existence. So at the same time, fire has the quality of heat, and I have the quality of pain when I touch it. Those are two things happening. One is external and one is internal. Pain is internal to me, and the heat is external to me. So internal to the fire, but so heat would be the internal quality, and heat would be the external quality, and pain would be the internal quality, because it's my perception, my impression. So he says, the heat of a fire, when moderate, is supposed to exist in the fire, but the pain which it causes upon a near approach is not taken to have any being except in the perception. So in the rest of this paper, he kind of gives two different understandings, and neither of them are his. So he gives what a vulgar person would say, which is just the ordinary person, and he also gives what the philosopher would say. And in both cases, he disagrees. So that's why this reading is kind of difficult, because he's not really giving his own opinion. He's just kind of saying, this is what they say, this is what they say, and at the end, neither of them are that great. So he talks about constancy and coherence. So constancy is kind of like the continued existence. And then coherence is a characteristic of external objects. It is something that keeps it together, keeps an object as one thing. He says, having found that the opinion of the continued existence of body depends on the coherence and constancy of certain impressions, I now proceed to examine after what manner these qualities give rise to so extraordinary an opinion. And he says, so then later he says, here, then I am naturally led to regard the world as something real and durable, and as preserving its existence, even when it is no longer present to my perception. He gets this based off of imagination. Objects have a certain coherence even as they appear to our senses, but this coherence is much greater and more uniform if we suppose the objects to have a continued existence, and as the mind is once in the train of observing a uniformity among objects, it naturally continues till it renders the uniformity as complete as possible. So this is all happening in your imagination. You're seeing things, your imagination is creating a coherence around these things, and a uniformity. And that's how you account for the continued existence and the distinct existence of things. So. He says, it's a false opinion that any of our objects or perceptions are identically the same after an interruption, and consequently the opinion of their identity can never arise from reason but must arise from imagination. So, if I'm looking at this marker, and then I take it away, like way away where I can't see it, and then I bring it back, that perception has been interrupted. And my perception now, as opposed to the last time I looked at it, is different in some way than the first time I saw it. It's never going to be identical. That's why you need coherence and constancy in your imagination to create that same experience. Like, okay, this is the same marker, even though my perception might be slightly different than the first time I saw it. So then he says that when we compare experiments and reason a little upon them, we quickly perceive that the doctrine of the independent existence of our sensible perceptions is contrary to the plainest experience. This leads us backward upon our footsteps to perceive our error in attributing a continued existence to our perception, and is the origin of many very curious opinions, which we shall here endeavor to account for. So he's saying that we can't use our perceptions to attribute continued existence to objects, which he's kind of been using perception to account for that. So that's why it gets a little confusing, because the conclusion of this is a skeptical conclusion. There is not a hard, solid conclusion at the end. So here he kind of explains what the philosophers are arguing. So the natural consequence of this reasoning should be that our perceptions have no more a continued than an independent existence. And indeed, philosophers have so far run into this opinion that they change their system and distinguish between perceptions and objects, of which the former are supposed to be interrupted and perishing and different at every different return. The latter to be uninterrupted and to preserve a continued existence and identity. So let's stop here and see what he's saying. He's saying that philosophers distinguish between perceptions of objects and objects in and of themselves. So the fact that my perception of this marker is different each time I look at it, slightly different angle, doesn't mean that the marker isn't the same in of itself. So that would be, my perception could be changing, but the object itself is not changing. So philosophers account for that by saying, okay, so there's a distinct difference between perception and object. Perception changes. Sometimes if I look at this water bottle, sometimes it looks gray and sometimes it looks green. That doesn't mean that the water bottle changes color all the time. It just means that my perception is kind of different depending on the light or whatever's going on at the time. But the object itself stays the same. So that's how philosophers account for this type of thing. But then Hume says, were we not first persuaded that our perceptions are our only objects and continue to exist even when they no longer make their appearances to the senses, we should never be led to think that our perceptions and objects are different and that our objects alone preserve a continued existence. So he's kind of talking like the philosopher's response in saying that perception and object are two different things. It's just a response to the vulgar understanding that that our perceptions are our only objects, that they're the same thing. So he said if we never had that misunderstanding to begin with, then we wouldn't need this new formulation that they're two different things. Because it creates this double existence. Everything has a double existence. It has a perceivable existence and just its own objective existence. So he explains the hypothesis, the philosophical hypothesis, by saying, this hypothesis is the philosophical one of the double existence of perceptions and objects, which pleases our reason in allowing that our dependent perceptions are interrupted and different, and at the same time is agreeable to the imagination in attributing a continued existence to something else which we call objects. This philosophical system, therefore, is the monstrous offspring of two principles which are contrary to each other, which are both at once embraced by the mind and which are unable mutually to destroy each other. The imagination tells us that our resembling perceptions have a continued and uninterrupted existence, and are not annihilated by their absence. Reflection tells us that even our resembling perceptions are interrupted in their existence and different from each other. The contradiction between these opinions elude a new fiction, which is conformable to the hypothesis both of reflection and fancy. Basically, he says that distinguishing between object and perception is doubly wrong. And he doesn't really tell us what the right answer is, as I have described. He just kind of says both are wrong. And later, we know Hume to be an empiricist and to be a materialist. So eventually in his writings, he will say that everything is material. So your mind is material. And he does talk... So you can only know things by your senses, by sense experience, according to the empiricists. So he puts a lot of weight on sense experience, on material objects. So he's going to be different from Descartes, because once again he's not a dualist, and he's going to be different from Spinoza because he's not a monist. He's not saying that all material things are one single thing, because Spinoza would say that all material things are just God. He's just saying that everything that exists is material, is natural. So it's kind of like a naturalist. And that's why he has such critiques for Christianity and for the design argument, because he uses natural theology to kind of show that the design argument is not good. So, I mean, he kind of ends this by saying, we find that philosophers neglect not this advantage of being similar to the ordinary understanding, but immediately upon leaving their closets, mingle with the rest of mankind in those exploded opinions, and that our perceptions are our only objects, and continue identically and uninterruptedly the same in all their interrupted appearances. Sorry. He doesn't really have an answer here, as I've said a billion times. So he ends with skepticism. And if you read the Reader's Guide on page 277 of the book, that's really helpful to kind of get the high points. I've tried to, touch on all those, but if you still are having a hard time understanding, then you should definitely read that. So the Reader's Guide helps because it says that Hume argues that the philosophers have distinguished the two continued and distinct perception and physical objects. They hold that interrupted perceptions are produced by uninterrupted physical objects such as books. Hume argues that this philosophical view, that there are two kinds of things, perceptions, physical objects, is just as confused as the vulgar one. So he says that double existence theory is just as confused as the ordinary person understanding. So that is Hume in a nutshell. It's kind of quick, but I didn't want to get too in-depth because it can get confusing if we really get too in-depth. So yeah, so next week we're still doing epistemology, and then that'll be our last week on epistemology. Then we'll move on. So yeah, let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you later.